For today. My name is Ryan Parker, and on behalf of Human Kinetics Investors, I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar, What is Integrative Sports Nutrition? This is the first of a four-part series presented by Ian Craig. Before we begin, I'd like to just take a few moments to tell you a little bit about today's webinar. It's scheduled to last for about an hour, of which the actual presentation will take around 45 minutes and will be followed by around 15 minutes for a question and answer session at the end. I have a few questions already prepared from what many of you have already submitted. If you do think of a question mid-presentation, please type it into the question box, which is located at the bottom right of your screen, and then click send. I'll be monitoring these throughout the broadcast, and we'll put as many forward as I can. We will also be live tweeting during the webinar using the hashtag SportsNutritionWebinar. Feel free to join us using the same hashtag, or you can tag us at Human Kinetics EU. The broadcast is being recorded and will be made available for download and playback on our website, www.humankinetics.com/webinars. This is usually available around 48 hours after the live broadcast. Everybody that's signed up will get a link to the recording. Today's presenter is Ian Craig. He's an exercise physiologist, nutritional therapist and NLP practitioner, and also an endurance coach. He's a former competitive middle distance runner and is now a more leisurely runner and cyclist. Ian specialises in integrative functional sports nutrition, which is a fast evolving discipline that considers both health and performance of an athlete from an integrative health perspective. Ian is the editor of Functional Sports Nutrition magazine and is a conference leader of Sports Nutrition Live. Born in Scotland, he now lives in South Africa, where he runs a private nutritional therapy in Johannesburg. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Ian Craig. Take it away, Ian.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you for Human Kinetics and Bases for giving me this opportunity for some exposure to a new audience. Just looking at my bookshelf here, it seems I've been following Human Kinetics for a few years now and enjoying their books. What is integrative sports nutrition? I'm not going to take a highbrow approach today. I'm not going to try and blind you by science. I'm just going to give you some concepts that hopefully get you thinking a little bit differently out of the standard sports nutrition paradigm. Before I start, I just want to give you a little bit of background on me, which will give you a sense of where how I got to what I'm doing today. This is me as an 11-year-old boy, sort of competing in the Scottish ranks, which was just the start of a 20-year journey towards trying to get in the Olympics. The very same year as that photograph was others, and I feel it's a valuable skill set that I've gained along the way. So just academically, I started off at good old Glasgow University, close to home, and then headed over the water to Greensboro in North Carolina, got my master's degree there. Came back and was probably the most overqualified personal trainer in the country. Did that for 3 years, but it gave me opportunity to run part-time. I only worked 20 hours a week. But around age 30, I realized, hey, I'm not going to make this Olympic thing. I started working a bit more seriously, found a group of strength and conditioning specialists down in London and joined them for a few years. Pete Williams and Charlene Hutzebut, if anyone have heard of them. And then I got into this arena of nutrition. I was inspired by a talk by Jeffrey Bland, the head of the Institute for Functional Medicine. And I went into nutritional therapy and learned and got another degree and became a therapist. but then I also started teaching for them. So it was a big learning platform for me, you know, around about 10 years ago. And then I met a South African girl, as you do, and immigrated to this beautiful place, that's Cape Town. And for the last 8 years, I've been working more clinically. So here are a few places I've worked for, mostly private practice. This is a genetics lab in Johannesburg that I've consulted for. And then in 2010, I became the editor of the Functional Sports and Nutrition magazine, which has been a really nice journey, and it's a great mag to try and get fresh ideas out into the sports and nutrition field. That arose the Sports Nutrition Live Conference, which is now an annual event, and then we did the FSN Academy. Last year I published my first book, not for sport, that's still in the works, but this is for general population. I was just fed up with fad diets, going from high fat, low carb to low carb, high fat, and nothing in between. So it's very much an educational approach for the lay person. This is a new initiative I'm working on with regards to bringing the integrative model into sports nutrition. So you'll see more of that later. And this is where I live now for my sins. It's the most stressful city in the world. You know, about 10 times more stressful than London, if you can believe that. But what it's learned me, my good English, what it's taught me is I'm dealing with a lot more complex clients, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, autoimmune people, but not your in the bed kind of people, the type of people who are still doing their normal life, and often they're still doing Ironman triathlons and things like that, but they're just not functioning well. And it's my job to try and improve their health so they can therefore live and perform better. Okay, so let's get into this a little bit. My question is, what is integrative sports nutrition? Is it pills and pots, or pots and pills? Is it your dietetic pyramids and really neat concepts like nutrient timing? Is it genetics and individuality, stroke functional ideals? Or is it just eating really good, wholesome, healthy food, which is part of the concept of my book? I'll argue that it's all of these. We can't just jump into one on its own. Here, I'm just going to pick on ACSM for a minute. This is the position statement from last year, 2016, fresh off the press. And I'm not going to go into the detail, but essentially you get the carbs, protein, and fat, sorry, jumping ahead, that are the focus point. It's very much based on macronutrients. They recognize iron in an athlete's diet, and since 2000, which I've been monitoring the changes, they've added in vitamin D, which has had enough research, and antioxidants now. But still the focus is on quantity. And I argue that there is a lot more to an athlete's health and human performance than just measuring your grams of macros. So here's a couple of food mottos. Quality comes before quantity. I'm more interested in where did that milk come from? Was it a healthy cow than is it high fat, low fat? That's relevant, it's important, but if it's a feedlot cow, there could be considerations of toxicity and sensitivity to the athlete's body. And food before nutrients, I mean, what does that mean? Instead of looking at a food as a number of grams of something, look at it as a food. So here's an example. What's that? An apple, right? Bread. And I think we know that's broccoli. So what's the commonality between these three foods? I would argue that there's bugger all commonality between these three foods, but they all contain 20 grams of carbohydrate. So if you talk to somebody who's into banting or a ketogenic approach, they tend to get lumped into macros and carbohydrates. So that's a carbohydrate we're eating. But the apple has got pectin, which is good for gastrointestinal health. The broccoli is full of glucosinolates, which is good for liver health. The brown bread from a packet, I'll argue there's not really much benefit of that one. Okay, I think we're also overdoing the macronutrient analysis. We've been studying the same macros for 20, 30 years. Here's a very recent study reviewing protein supplementation with regards to muscle damage, soreness, and basically recovery. This is basically in the concluding remarks. Acute changes in post-exercise protein synthesis and anabolic intracellular signaling have not resulted in measurable reductions in muscle damage and enhanced recovery of muscle function. Okay, so do we stop there? Do we not take protein after exercise because of research like this? Or do we actually feel a bit and say, well, yeah, I think it helps me. I can feel an improved benefit. This was a conference in Joburg last year. Andrew Bosch from UCT. He was able to stand up and bravely say there is enough of a question mark to warrant using protein to aid recovery. I like his approach. It wasn't a yes, we definitely should, but we can question the research and potentially use it in individual cases. Here's micronutrient confusion. So on the left-hand side, vitamin C can reduce DOMS. Breyer and Goldfarb was at Greensboro when I was there. So they were looking at eccentric elbow extensions with vitamin C 3 grams a day or placebo for 3 weeks, and they were able to conclude that vitamin C prevented the increase in oxidized glutathione, that's obviously a good thing, and reduced the creatine kinase increase after exercise, which is an indication of muscle damage. On the right-hand side, you've got Graham Clothes from Liverpool. 1 gram per day, and they were looking at downhill running, so quite a different sort of study, but they found that muscle function was impaired post-exercise in both groups, although a delayed recovery was noted with the vitamin C. So that led to a whole lot of controversy within antioxidant supplementation, now for 10 years, more than 10 years. But if you take one of their camps, you maybe miss the point. There might be, in some cases with some individual, a case for vitamin C supplementation. Or maybe let's not do vitamin C at all, but you can take more of a superfood, if you want to use a slang for certain high antioxidant level berries, for example, and use that in moderation in a post-exercise smoothie. That's how I tend to use the information, rather than dosing high on things that there is a bit of a confusion about. Okay, what is integrative sports nutrition? Is it supplements? Is it performance nutrition? Quantities, nutrient timing, macros? Well, I would argue there's a level below that. A lot of sports nutritionists work in this space and in this space. Some even just work in this space, which I think is very limited. So I want to know the functionality of the person's health. We don't often hear health combined with performance. It's not the same. I would argue that a lot of athletes are very elite athletes, but their health is poor. I'm working with a very top-end long-distance triathlete at the moment who's achieved pretty good things in 2016, but she's really, really struggling health-wise right at the moment. But I've added another layer below it, and that's the food quality, the quality before quantity. Okay, so just before I fire into the depth of the presentation, I little bit of history of integrative or functional medicine. This is a book I found online, which is quite a nice resource, and it starts from the 1960s, where like chiropractors were gaining accreditation in the States and so on. But I'll jump a wee bit ahead. Integrative medicine or functional medicine, they're just different uses of words, but essentially the same kind of thing. It's a very new kind of medicine, but they're using very old strategies like Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine and old herbal strategies and so on. The Townsend letter I'll mention, that's an integrative sort of medicine newsletter. It's still going today. It's full of top content. Functional, the Institute for Functional Medicine, which Jeffrey Bland used to head up. That was started in the early 90s. That's a very significant one. And then we have another few things that are all building the integrative medical space, culminating in the early 2000s with a White House commission, would you believe it? So it's well accepted now, and even in South Africa where I live, you'll get homeopaths and naturopaths that are registered on the same medical boards as doctors. So some of these principles that I'm borrowing to bring over to the sport. So I want to leap over the Atlantic and come back to the UK. In 1984, Patrick Colford set up the Institute for Optimum Nutrition using Linus Pauling as kind of the figurehead of that. So that's been going a long time now. They punt out, give or take, 100 graduates every year. The British Association of Nutritional Therapy, that was started before 2000. Then we got the Centre for Nutrition Education, that was where I was trained. They started a degree and later a master's degree. And then we've seen the CAM magazine, which has been going, it's celebrating its 15th birthday now. That's a sister magazine to Functional Sports Nutrition. And then for the last 4 years, they've been doing conferences in conjunction with BANT. So there's a lot of stuff out there, but looking worldwide, I did a really good search. There's not much application of this knowledge into sport, which is where I lie. And I worked for CNE for 3 years before I emigrated, and it was 2007 they asked me to do a sports nutrition course. I searched high and wide for a textbook. So what I ended up doing was actually using the textbook for functional medicine from the Institute for Functional Medicine, and also some more common sports nutrition books in our field, like McCardle Catch and Catch and a few others, and just trying to combine areas. So we still don't have a book in that area that can pull the two areas together. Okay, so let's tell you what this mysterious thing, the functional model, is. Just have a quick sip of water. Right, this has been around for years. It's a spider's web, and the way to explain this is basically every body system is all connected together. And if you go into a hospital, or if you open a medical textbook or a physiology textbook, these are all separate chapters, and it's all got experts in that field talking about it, but it's the interrelation that we're very interested in. And I'm going to open out a couple of areas in a minute. If you were a naughty kid, like I think I was occasionally, you might ping the corner of a spider's web. What would happen to the spider's web? It would collapse, wouldn't it? Pretty much the whole thing collapsed. That's basically what can happen to our health if any one of these systemic areas causes problems. Some more than others, but the potential is there. This is a timeline. Every student of nutritional therapy gets trained in using the timeline, so they might, in certain cases, go back before conception. So if there's suspicions of certain medical conditions or imbalances in health that stems from the health of their parents. This would obviously be bringing genetics into it as well, but also how healthy was the mum and dad before conception, during the pregnancy, early childhood, etc., etc. And I've now got 2 little kiddies, so any of you who have kids will know by now that the early stages in life are really, really important for long-term health. And it's actually quite difficult in this day and age to keep them healthy. So there's a lot of information back then, but you pull out the relevant stuff from the timeline that's helpful for you as a practitioner to make that person healthier. And that includes athletes. We tend to put athletes on a pedestal because they're so physically excellent that they can't possibly have anything wrong with them. But actually the physiological load or stress that they're putting their body under, often eventually something cracks, which is often why many athletes have short careers, and the ones that try and do a longer career end up something happening, or they just start struggling health-wise. I gave up athletics after trying for 20 years to run to my best abilities. I gave up athletics 15 years ago. I can still feel the pressure on my body. It does take a lot out of you. And here's it's a newer functional medicine matrix. It's quite a nice one. If you just follow my cursor, you'll see the same kind of stuff as on the spider's web, but there's a little bit more focus now on mental, emotional, spiritual patterns and what that means to that individual. So psychology, not just straight sports psychology, but patterns of behavior and unconscious processes that can impact the body. And then on the left-hand side, you've got antecedents, triggers, and mediators. These students of nutritional therapy will actually note on this kind of sheet to get their thoughts together with a new client. And then all the lifestyle factors. You can see nutrition is only one of them. When I work with clients, I work on all of these things. Not in depth sometimes. I'm not going to become a relationship counselor, but I want to know if there's an issue there and then refer off if required. This is a graph from a questionnaire that I use. And basically, it's a very detailed questionnaire. It takes a while to fill in. And I just want to take you through this one. So, what are the high things? Ears, nose, and throat. That's immune. Other things, where is it? Okay, connective tissue, muscle, and nerves. In an athlete, these are the 2 worst things, injury and illness. Am I going to go straight there? No, I'm going to start with their gut, because as you'll learn later, the gut immune focus is very, very strong. The gut connective tissue integrity is very, very strong. And secondly, I'm going to work on the adrenals. This is just for me, in this case, my personal choice. But another practitioner might go about it differently. But dealing with these 2 things, I'm going to actually look at completely different things because they're totally related. The adrenal fatigue is actually dragging down different body systems. Well, central nervous system I've added in there as well. I'll bring that over with the stress so we can work kind of endocrinologically here, but neurally here. And that's kind of looking at sympathetic, parasympathetic balance, and we'll talk more about that next week in the overtraining session. But nutrition's not everything. Here it is here in a lovely cog diagram, and I stole this from Athletes Performance a few years ago. It's a lovely website, and just recreated it. So for an athlete, lots of different things come together, and certain things that aren't even there. Excuse me, I just lost my headphones. Certain things that aren't in there are lifestyle patterns. Sleep, that's not in there. Recuperation patterns, massage, recovery sessions. they come into rest and fatigue, but we can expand out on these areas. And this is a funny spaceship diagram that I put together once, and I won't bore you with it, but it's just looking at different levels of systems and processes in the body and where actually digestion fits. Digestion to me is how the nutrition gets into the body and assimilates into molecules, cells of any system in the body. So it influences everything. And we got a direction downwards, and then we also got the connection with the nervous system, the endocrine system, and ultimately the higher centers. And then we don't tend to bring this universe thing in enough. There's a lot of factors that can affect an athlete's mood, health, performance. Okay, so let's expand out on two of these areas. I've chosen GI health and energy to go into in more details, and they were two of the parts of that spider's web that you saw earlier. So I just want you to get, again, I'm not going into huge detail, but I want you to get the cross-disciplinary aspects of the systemic body systems. Okay, this is a lovely old study, quite old now, but still very relevant. GI symptoms are experienced by 30 to 65% of long-distance runners and no doubt many other athletes. Blood flow to the splanchnic system declines from about 1.5 liters to 1/3 of a liter from rest to maximum exercise. Splanchnic region is your gut, your liver, your kidneys, pancreas, all the organs in the central system. Now, can you imagine what 1.5 liters is? It's like 2 water bottles going to the gym per minute, down to 1/3, which is kind of like just a standard glass of water. It's a big shift. The blood's all shifted to the exercise and muscles. It's not surprising that the gut can become under pressure with mucosal compromise. What's mucosal compromise? There's a slang phrase called leaky gut. Leaky gut's something I deal with on a daily basis, which can lead to lots of different things happening in the body. And one of the thing mentioned here is a leakage of endotoxins into the portal or the liver circulation. So by having a compromised gut, we can actually compromise or increase the liver load that the athlete is experiencing. Okay, I just want to mention Justin Roberts' talk last year at Sports Nutrition Live. It was a really lovely talk. He's a researcher. He came up with some nice strategies for gut health. So there's a list of things to minimize and eliminate, including certain levels of fat, fiber, protein, lactose, non-steroidals. These are all things that can possibly irritate the gut in certain athletes. And then on the right-hand side, we've got things or nutrients that can support the gut health. Pro and prebiotics, colostrum, glutamine have all been shown to improve intestinal permeability, or reduce it rather. Then you got EFAs, or your fish and seed oils, nitric oxide stimulation, which is your beetroot juice now, which I think is a wonderful part of modern research because it's real food. We can have beetroot juice instead of a commercial sports drink for a pre or a post exercise nutrition. Okay, so let's go and link off from the gut to different places. The first one I'm going to go to is the brain. And there's something called the gut-brain axis. There's books written about this thing, and its gut compromise has been very heavily linked. I've got a colleague in Cape Town who deals with this stuff, with mental function. She deals mostly with kids, so ADHD and autism and so on, but she also deals with just mood. What happens if an athlete's dopamine and serotonin levels are low coming up to a competition or during important training. Is that quite relevant or not? Of course it is. They need to be focused. If you have a foggy brain because you've got a leaky gut and therefore a leaky blood-brain barrier in conjunction, it's a big factor. Then we're going to systemic inflammation, but it could be localized inflammation. When I used to get injured, which was a lot, I kind of drank more beer and ate more rubbishy food because in a way I was drowning my sorrows. But what I know now is that very much wasn't the right thing to do. I should have been eating more fish and fish oil and seeds and green leafy vegetables and fresh food, and try to decrease my stress and spend the time I should be normally training doing something relaxing, like maybe some yoga even. Oh, the Y word, we can't mention that. The gut, if there's inflammation in the gut, it tends to lead to inflammation pretty much anywhere else in the body, including the brain, but sometimes it can be more systemic, more specific in location than that, okay? So if you have a sports injury, it's in your best interest to calm down the inflammation in the gut, which in turn will calm down the systemic inflammation, and therefore it will potentially increase the speed of your recovery from injury. Okay, the immune system. Have you ever been asked the question, how big is the gut? Because I've read this, quite interesting information somewhere. If you take the gut out of the body and lay it flat, including all the nooks and crannies, the villi and microvilli, it takes up a tennis court, give or take. That's a lot bigger than just the skin surface area. So there's a lot of immune surveillance that needs to be in and around the gut, which is why it's been estimated by many people that plus or minus 70% of the immune system lies in and around the gut. So if I have somebody who has immune compromise, or they have allergies, they're going through hay fever season and they've got important competitions coming up, I'll work on their gut first. Then with asthma, lung health, it's mucosal membranes you're working on to influence mucosal membranes. And then mitochondria, which is our next section. If you are not absorbing nutrients effectively, what is that going to do to your energy? It can potentially deplete the micronutrients and the macronutrients available to the mitochondria for production of ATP. Plus, that systemic inflammation, it can get to the cellular level as well, so it might not be operating quite as effectively. So one more slide on the gut, and that's the 4R program, and it's a program that was initiated or formalized, I should say, by the Institute for Functional Medicine. All these protocols have been around for a long, long time, but they just put it into a more systematic way of using it. First R is remove, and that's food sensitivities, toxicity, pathogens, it could be microorganisms. I do a lot of stool testing. I might be finding parasites or particular bacteria like a Klebsiella, for example, that's just causing systemic inflammation, which is dragging down the overall health of the body, and the person's just not very vibrant anymore. Food sensitivities, I'll give you a quick example of a long-distance trail runner. He goes and does these hectic races, 100-kilometer races here. He was finding after, say, 70, 80 kilometers of a race, he was having severe gastrointestinal problems and not able to consume anything. That obviously hinders his performance hugely. He estimated by an hour in the last race he did, which is a difference between a podium finish and 20th, 30th. We did food sensitivity testing with him. Dairy was a big thing for him, plus another few things. We've cut down the dairy. His gut is generally calmed down, and now we're waiting for his next race to just see if how big a role that has. So I follow Justin's advice in the on-the-day kind of nutrition that will help gut health, but I'm also working on the gut months before they actually need to put pressure on it. Secondly, replace stomach acid and digestive enzymes. How many of us run around like crazy idiots and eat sandwiches on the run or smoothies in the car on the way to training or from training? Which nervous system do we need to actually break down and digest food well? It's a no-brainer. It's the parasympathetic. You need to be in a relaxed state to properly digest. And this is where standard dietetics falls down as well. If you're just looking at quantities and you're looking at, okay, 100 grams of protein coming in a day, how much of that is the athlete absorbing? One might be absorbing most of it and another absorbs half of it based on just this. So we need to actually start asking these questions. And there's some very easy symptoms like bloating, burping, repeating reflux, indigestion, discomfort, and then obviously it affects lower down with symptoms there as well. Re-inoculate, pre and probiotics. Probiotics are well proven and accepted in sports nutrition now. Pre, that will require a bit of time, but that's basically just your food for the probiotics. Things like slightly greenish bananas contain a lot of prebiotics. Inulin is a prebiotic. Jerusalem artichokes, not the most common thing, but you can, if you can get them, slice them, put them in your soup and cook them well. Don't have too many or you might be farting a bit too much. And the last one is repair the intestinal lining. That was on Justin's slide with colostrum and the glutamine, also butyric acid that comes out of good quality milk. So all different strategies, and we can use immunoglobulins as well. I've got some nice supplements that provide them. So there's lots of different strategies where you can actually support a basic aspect of the athlete's health. Do you think if the health of their gut is better, they'll perform better? I do, certainly in the long term. Okay, so let's consider energy, and the mitochondria is the, very much the example of that. That's where all the work happens. So the mitochondria is more than just something that pumps out ATP. The postulation has been made that decreased energy production may result in hypothalamic dysfunction, which then manifests as hormonal imbalances, insomnia, immune system dysfunction, with resultant frequent infections and autonomic dysfunction. Wow, that's quite a lot from just not producing energy. You have to remember that mitochondria are not just in our muscle cells. They're in every system, every organ in our body. So mitochondria has been very, very heavily linked to chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. And these are diagnosable diseases, if you like, but they're also, to me, symptoms. You get many athletes that get mild acute fibromyalgia. In other words, they don't just get the regular DOMS from increasing the intensity of a training program. They get DOMS that linger. They might not have trained hard for a couple of days, but they're still getting up and they're stiff in the morning and they're taking a while to get going and the energy is not brilliant. We can help a lot with that. Okay, do you recognize this? I'll fail you from your Physics 101 if you don't. This is what we're taught in physiology. And this is from Ricardo Catch and Catch, so a well-known nutrition, sports nutrition book. But what we're not taught is this. How many of you honestly can say exactly what nutrients are required for each step of the Krebs cycle? So very true that B vitamins are energetic nutrients, so we need them. And we need to know this. And we also need to know if there's energy issues that we can test for it. Here's a little bit more complex situation. So fats, carbs, proteins, we need to know the integration of how they go into the Krebs cycle. In other words, even though we don't want to, we might need to know a bit of biochemistry. This is a lab test, a functional lab test, showing all the steps of the Krebs, and you can see fumaric acid is a little bit elevated. In other words, it's not converting to malic acid well enough, which is probably why this malic acid is a bit on the low side. What do we do about that? Well, we might need to supplement a bit of malic acid. If there was a coenzyme here, that's what you'd provide. And this is a lab test. I'm not going to go into the detail here or I'll get bogged down, but it's a little lab in Devon that actually looks at how much ATP is in the mitochondria of a particular individual. If they're feeling flat, if they're feeling overtrained, it's a lovely little test to do. And the second page of this, I'm just going to highlight something for you. This is a translocation, the translocation kind of part, which is moving ATP across the mitochondrial membrane and ADP back in for recycling to ATP. This person was a bit low on the translocation of getting the ADP back in. That's because of some issue with the membrane. Now, there's lots of different reasons for this, but one of them can be heavy metals. And what athlete is not exposed to some mercury fillings or lead still in the atmosphere, or cigarette smoke providing cadmium, or a bit of nickel in their pots and pans? They deplete glutathione. They also block these translocation actions in the mitochondria. Okay, so enough of specific areas. These I could spend all day just talking about one area, but it gives you a flavor of the kind of way that I work in terms of integrative sports nutrition. So I just want to finish off with individuality, because I don't think we recognize that enough. This is a great book. It goes back to 1956, at the time of Watson and Crick discovering the double helix in DNA. He was actually standing up and questioning the RDAs and saying that people are all individuals and need different things, and actually we need to look at gene, nutrient, environmental interactions and not just the genes. So that's what we do these days. We look at genetic code, but then we understand how we can influence that by lifestyle and dietary factors. This is my old mentor. Excuse me, just having a sip of water. Kate Neal's the proprietor of the Center for Nutrition Education. And it's a lovely, lovely quote. Individuals are multivariable, nonlinear, high-order, differential, and adaptive systems that interact in a multivariable. You got the story there. It's important to recognize people as individuals. And if you want to stick with straight sports nutrition research, you'll all recognize this guy. Certain supplements can provide favorable results in certain individuals, neutral effects in others, and even detrimental effects in some people. This is Ross Tucker. He's actually a prodigy of Tim Noakes in Cape Town. He's now in the Free State as a lecturer. Tim Noakes has been in the press a lot, and as his ex-student, he built up the courage to basically write a very poignant piece against the work that Tim was trying to do, the very, as he calls it, dogmatic low-carb diet. And he made a plea for balance, scientific rigor, and not scientific dogma. And we're seeing a bit of dogmatic research in science at the moment. I love science, I think it's great, but we need to actually look at it from a philosopher's perspective and have a little bit of integrity as well when we're looking at it. This is his quote: "If our intentions are genuine and we want the best possible outcome for the highest possible number of people, we'll see that some people benefit more from X and others from Y. If we're rigid and defensive, and if we own our own position too strongly, then we make that less likely to happen." Another couple of quotes from his paper. "Knowledge changes, but sound thinking, logic, and common sense do not. So we have the responsibility to push back against hypocritical, narrow, and incomplete debating methods." And he put it, so Roger, the human body is centuries in advance of the physiologist and can perform an integration of heart, lungs and muscles which is too complex for the scientists to analyze. Well, probably not. We'll probably eventually get to a point where we can get very, very deep. I mean, we're looking at pretty deep genetics now. But he has a very strong point that we can't understand everything, and we can't just wait till research comes along to take action. So as a practitioner, as I'm sure many of you are, or a coach or a trainer, you have the liberty to take the information that you can find out there and put it into interpretative practice. And what you get the best results of from as a practitioner, then you're a good practitioner. If you hang on and wait for the right research, I think there's a certain, sorry, I've got another slide coming up that I thought I was at. There's a certain amount of paralysis. Okay, go through this again. Right, this is a really lovely little study. You'll see Tim Noakes is in the listing there. It's 10 years ago. High carb versus high fat. Now, the same 8 cyclists did a 70% fat diet 1 week and did a 100K time trial, and then 70% fat diet the other week and 100K, well, there's a washout period, etc., etc. And crossover design. They found that you can see the bar chart is lower, i.e. their time is quicker for the high carb approach versus the high fat approach. So most of these lines are going down, but can you notice there's 2 climbing up? So that means 2 out of 8, 20% of the subject population actually got better on a high fat diet. There's the individuality. But the conclusion of the study, bear in mind it was still kind of in the low fat era, certainly in South Africa, they concluded simply that high carb was better. Now here's another study. I just want to show you shifting in scientists' mind. Here's Tim Noakes again, so it's his lab, looking at variability in exercise capacity and metabolic response during endurance exercise after a low-carb diet. The effect is highly variable between individuals and independent of changes in carbohydrate oxidation. Tim Noakes is all for high-fat, low-carb now, so he's shifted a lot from his previous thinking. But this research has still been done. It's still there, still important. It doesn't just disappear. We need to be looking at both sides. And interestingly, there's another study that I looked up that compared a 20% fat diet with a 40% fat diet. And performance-wise, they were getting on better with a 40% fat diet, which to me is not very surprising because 20% is really getting into potential fat depletion. And obviously you're not going to maximize fat oxidation rates. But 40% is a fairly normal figure. I certainly do a lot of dietary interventions with that kind of levels of fat. Certainly not 70%, but sometimes 40. So I think we should be looking at middle levels of fat as well. Okay, so just to round up, lack of evidence is not evidence of lack. And I think we're paralyzing our thinking by analyzing in some cases. This is a great little book. We have to remember that we are an N of 1. We can learn of N of 10 or N of 100, but I am N of 1, you are N of 1, your athlete is N of 1. So personalize the information. We all know scatter plots. This is just an illustration that we've got the outliers, and outliers is a scientific term, but the majority of us are somewhere scattered in the middle. Oh, why did the screen go black? Let's see, the black thinking in science sometimes. Oh, or white thinking. I actually prefer this. and there's probably a few more than 50 shades of grey. In other words, look at the subtleties of research and try and tease out the detail. And that's another little diagram that I put together, this sort of black-white spectrum. Where are we in between? I love the Mediterranean diet if you go old enough, not the modern interpretation. I'm talking about rural Greece, not with lots of bread, rural Italy, not with lots of pasta. And this is essentially what I'm trying to do. These two areas are quite separate right now. I've studied both in separate institutes. I'd like to try and pull them together and get a little bit more discussion of how we can incorporate integrative knowledge into sports nutrition practice. Final slide. The field of sports nutrition is a dynamic one. The understanding of ex-phys, psychology, integrated metabolism and biochemistry are integral to success. So that's from the ISSN quite a few years ago, but I really like it. So a few references for you, and these are my details if you would like. Okay, Ryan, I'm done. If we can hand over to you again.
Yes, thanks Ian, very informative webinar there. Sorry if anybody lost sound near the beginning there. I know I think a few of you lost sound for about 30 seconds to a minute, but thanks for sticking with us. We'll now spend the next 15 minutes or so going through a bit of a Q&A session. So I want to start with a question from Anne Mayer from the United States. She asks, what can you offer regarding tips to reduce cortisol response, especially post-exercise?
Okay, especially post-exercise, yeah?
Yeah.
I think that's a great question because I actually study cortisol quite a lot, and there's the general health indications of what you should do day to day to try and reduce that. If we study the neural system, we've got sympathetic versus parasympathetic balance. How do we actually get a little bit, well, spend a little bit more time in parasympathetic? We need to actually be doing more sitting, reflecting, moving slowly, eating slowly. So an athlete, if they're elite and are full-time, they have the time to do that, but they should make a point of doing it. And I personally now practice yoga. I find it's a good way, well, certain types of yoga, there are various types, and some will send you straight into sympathetic. It's a good way of moving the body and actually doing a recuperative practice to get yourself into the parasympathetic and to tone down the endocrine system. So you're thinking about the HP axis, output to the adrenals, so that's the endocrine output, but also through the pituitary you've got the whole of the nervous system control. So yeah, the exercise, if you're an endurance athlete, have some of the week where you're actually under a kind of threshold where it becomes an easy run, an easy cycle, an easy swim, where you can talk to somebody and you can focus on your breathing and your rhythm, and you almost become meditative in the process. Meditation's quite hard for me. Some people do it fine, but I prefer to kind of think about a meditative state. Even just walking between meetings, you can slow it down and actually feed off the breathing. So there's a central theme there of breathing. If you actually deflate the diaphragm effectively, you push against the vagal nerve and the parasympathetic nervous system. So that's why breathing, meditation, yoga, things like that are effective. But you can simply sit down, say you're with clients and you've got 1 minute between clients where you need to rush off again, sit down and take even 30 seconds, take 2 deep breaths. And it's a nice, long, drawn, fill up the belly, not just the chest, the belly, and then sigh out. And the sigh gives a nice push down into the diaphragm. So that's one method. Foods, it's a big topic I can't go into today, but if you're eating foods that are against your system, I mentioned food sensitivities before, you're going to aggravate your immune system. Immune system aggravation will fire up stress, adrenal responses, and just you're not getting enough nutrients from the body. And then how do you nourish the adrenals? B vitamins, B6, B5 are very important. Tyrosine, I use a combination of herbs like ashwagandha or ginseng and just gently nourish the adrenal glands. That sounds like you're jacking it up, but it's not caffeine. You're actually just giving a bit more resource to the adrenals so they're not under so much stress. But ultimately you need to calm down the hypothalamus pituitary output, which means going above them to the head space. The head needs to be more relaxed. And for that I use things like GABA and threonine, a bit of green tea, you'll find threonine in there. What else? Even hops or chamomile or valerium. There's some pre-bed strategies that I use there. So that's kind of general. Sorry, a long answer to your question, but it's a big area. Post-exercise, instead of just getting a commercial sports drink that's going to be full of sugar and probably fairly nasty quality whey or casein or something, I like doing smoothies and make a lovely berry smoothie that's high in antioxidants, banana plus berry plus a completely plain whey isolate or concentrate, some sugar-free nut butter, a little bit of raw honey if you can get it, and some glutamine powder, maybe even BCAAs, but not so much because it will affect the taste. You get the story. It's kind of building up a nice recuperative strategy, and if you've done a really hard session, you maybe could put a little bit of fruit juice in there, which can get a bit of sugar that you require for your system. I like to use kefir or kefir, so like a milk kefir or a coconut kefir, so that brings in the probiotics. So it's trying to bring in lots of things, which will do lots of different strategies, but you know, in the meantime, you're just focusing on cortisol. So I hope that gives you a few ideas, the sort of thinking I have around that, but it is a very big topic.
Yeah, I mean, very, very well answered. I believe some of the DIY sports drinks you've been talking about might be covered in the last webinar as well, so perhaps
yes,
go into that a little bit more detail.
You have to tune in again, okay?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, thanks. That was perfectly answered. Thanks for the question, Anne. The second question is from Edinburgh student David Carlton, who asks, how big a role do you think nutrition plays in elite sport? He says obviously it's important, but are there more important aspects, do you believe?
Thanks from Edinburgh. I hope it's nice and cold there. Remember that cog diagram I put up earlier, and you've got lots of different aspects of physiology. Nutrition is one cog of the entire network, and it's possibly, it's not possibly the best, it's certainly one of the best methods to improve the health of your athlete's body. But lifestyle strategies, like I just mentioned on the cortisol question, are really, really key as well. And they give the support to that whole cog network. And if you remember the pyramid that I put down, if you can get the base of the pyramid solid, in other words, your base health is good, which, yeah, you have to use nutrition, you have to use mindfulness, you have to do good sleeping strategies, you have to have good recuperation methods. That builds the health, and then it's like building a house on a nice solid foundation, as opposed to you just throw a few bricks down and slap some cement on, but not seal the joints very nicely. That could crumble in a few years' time or a few months' time. So build the foundations. So nutrition's not everything, it's part of the whole, but every athlete, if they've got ambition, needs to be looking at it.
Yeah, the whole package. Excellent. The third question comes from Gareth Pritchard, who's a sports scientist. He would like to get your thoughts on ketogenic and low-carb diets. I know you spoke briefly about this in the webinar, but he says, like, particularly wants to know about endurance athletes. Are there any positives or negatives in relation to a low-carb diet?
Yeah, okay, so this is another, I could do a whole talk and whole day talk maybe. I hope you got some insight with regards to that on the way I deal with that kind of question through the presentation. You have the outliers that do extremely well on ketogenic diets, and if you're interested in that area, follow my colleague Alex Ferretti. He's down south, and he's doing quite a lot of work in the ketogenic space. He's written for the FSN magazine as well. If you can't find him, just try and make contact with me and I'll connect you or send you his articles. But really, really interesting stuff. He argues that you can train the body to become fat adapted, but you have to do it for several months. I stay in ketosis, measurable ketosis for several months. At that point, he plays judo. At that point, you can actually bring in nutrient timing of like a carb loading or supplementation strategy to do your sport, and then you fall back into ketosis very, very quickly. But in the short term, it takes an awful long time to get into ketosis, but it takes 1 minute to get out of ketosis. There's definitely a reason why we have different biochemical systems. So I showed you after the Krebs cycle, the carbs, protein, fats all coming into the Krebs. We can metabolize all of them. Why do we have the biochemistry for all of them if we only need fat? We need fat for sitting on our backsides, for walking, for basic jobs, because that's the slow burn. It's got a massive resource of energy, but it's slow burn. And it's been, I did a presentation on this a couple of years ago. You can go up to 60 to 70% of your VO2 max, give or take, based on the individual, on fat metabolism. But to tap into the higher intensities, you need carb metabolism. So an endurance athlete, I'm certainly keen on somebody doing a 100K trail run or a multi-stage mountain bike race or something like that to get them more fat adapted. I was talking about the research earlier about how it seems to be extremes. It's like comparing 70% carb diet to a 70% fat diet. It's like comparing apples and pears. They're completely different. What about a 70 compared to a 40, or a 40 compared to a 20, like that study I mentioned? We need more of that. So if you go too fat adapted, you go under carb adapted. So you don't metabolize carbs so well. So even on that long trail run, there's generally a few hills on trail runs. When you have to go up a hill and you hit into 80-90% of VO2 max for 5 minutes, hey, you just don't have the edge. And then you lose somebody and they surge ahead of you by 30 seconds and make a break. So it can be quite important. So I like to sit on the fence, and you might have gathered, and actually view from both sides and take it very individual specific. I know me personally, if I went on a high-fat diet, I would start falling down drains. I'm still skinny after years of not running. I need my carbs, and I can feel that. But many of my clients, they can go out on a Sunday morning, have a cup of coffee, go for 5 hours on their bike, come back, have a cup of coffee, and eventually have breakfast. They're the kind of people that might do better on a ketogenic diet. But I've got a big question mark as to whether you need to go all the way ketogenic, or if there can be like a paleo type diet. Just by taking carbs out of the diet, you do tend to reduce the carbs. Sorry, by taking the grains out of the diet, you do tend to reduce the carbs anyway. So a lot of people might do well on that. It's a case of trying and listening and just using your intuition a bit.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, all down to the individual. I'll just ask one more question because I know we're slightly running over. This comes from strength and conditioning coach James Davis. He says, what protocols do you use for athletes and teams that are traveling around the world with their sport and always on planes? Do you have any like supplement recommendations or food recommendations, he asks?
Yeah, you need to do as much research as possible to find out where you're going to be staying. If the budget is there, cherry pick the hotel, or it might be an athlete's village or something. If it's a hotel, cherry pick it yourself as a team coach or something, where they're actually looking at more whole food choices and, you know, dare I say it, can they get grass-fed, you know, beef or good quality fermented yogurt or whatever. If it's an athlete's village, you get what you get, but you need to have done your homework to understand what is available and make a bit of a pre-plan as to what you know about each athlete. Keep them away from the pizza bars and things like that,
yeah.
But really stay on the whole food as much as possible. With the travel though, certain countries bring the fear of gastro, and I personally dose people up on strong probiotics weeks before. But more than that, I really use fermented foods a lot now. It's like a new pet of mine now. And literally it is, there's like these little grain things that look like cauliflower heads, mini cauliflower heads. You put them in your milk, and 2 days later you have kefir, which is fermented milk, and it's really, really good for the gut flora. So get into the strategies of fermented products in their diet. Sauerkraut is another one, German cabbage, but properly fermented sauerkraut and not just cabbage soaked in vinegar as the cheaper versions are. So you need to check thoroughly and go through real health food sort of sites and places to get that information.
Is that the ones in the supermarkets then? Are they sort of just left in vinegar to ferment?
To be honest, Ryan, I haven't looked in a UK supermarket because it's only recently I've been doing it in South Africa. But in South Africa, you'll only get the vinegar ones in the supermarkets. But you get these little niche health shops that focus more on food than supplements, and that's where you'll get them. Or my wife makes it, and she's written a lot on our website, which I showed you earlier. So there's lots of blogs and stuff on fermented food, so feel free to have a look. The other thing, the probiotics, not just a cheapie out of Boots that has 1 billion microorganism, one strain, for example. You want to at least get 3 or 4 strains in there. Very reputable company. You need to be spending on it. The ones I use cost equivalent of about £30 for a month's supply for a general protocol, but pre-traveling out actually double that. So they're getting in a good dosage, like ideally a month before. Say they go to India, absolutely. And I'd also bring in Saccharomyces boulardii, which is a friendly yeast, and that's very, very good for avoiding gastrointestinal issues.
Right. Excellent. Yeah, thanks for that. We'll leave the questions there because, like I said, we've slightly run over. But please do join us next week. We've got the second of the 4 webinars with Ian. You can find out about all our webinars on humankinetics.com/webinars. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank everybody who sent the webinar, who's listening via the recording or via the Human Kinetics website. I'd also like to thank Ian for a fantastic and informative presentation. Just when the webinar closes, could you take a couple of minutes to fill out a short survey? We appreciate your feedback. It helps us continually improve. I'd also like to mention that Human Kinetics now have 12 basis approved courses. So if you need them extra CPD points, we have a few courses there for you. Yes, I'll send you an email within the next sort of 48 hours which has the recording. And I'm now going to end the webinar there. Enjoy the rest of your day, your afternoon or morning, wherever you are, and I hope to see you again next week. Thanks again.